The Guarin family has never quite held the prestige of the Cuslans of Highever or the royal Therin dynasty, but they have long been the Arls of Redcliffe, the famed fortress which has only been captured 3 times in its long history. The first was 4 centuries ago during the Exalted Age, when King Calenhad conquered it in his campaign to unite Ferelden and found the kingdom. The second was when the Orlesians captured it during their conquest of Ferelden during the Blessed Age. The Guarins ultimately decided to support the Orlesians, as they lacked faith in King Brandel's ability to defeat them. The actions of the Guarins in later years would make them heroes in Ferelden, however. When Moira Therin took up her father's cause of freeing Ferelden from Orlesian rule, she determined that Arl Rendorn Guarin would be needed for the rebellion to succeed. Moira allowed herself to be captured by Arl Rendorn's men, gambling that he would be unwilling to turn his rightful queen over to the Orlesians. She proved correct. Rendorn was persuaded to join the rebellion and held a coronation ceremony for Moira in Redcliffe Castle before fleeing to join the rebel army. He brought with him his eldest child, Rowan, an accomplished warrior in her own right, now betrothed to the young Prince Marek. Arlessa Marina, the Earl's wife, took their 2 younger sons, Eamon and Tegan, to refuge with her relatives in the Free Marches. Marina's elder sister was Talia Arum, then ruling Margravine of Ansburg. Sadly, the Arlessa became ill on the journey across the Waking Sea. They took a carriage from Wycombe to Ansburg, but she survived only 1 day after reaching the family estate. Eamon and Tegan were raised by their aunt and uncle, who treated them as their own children. Back in Ferelden, Arl Rendorn became the rebellion's leading military mind and commander of the Army of the South. When the rebel queen was assassinated in 896 Blessed, the Arl continued to serve in that role when Prince Marek succeeded her, despite his frustrations with the prince's insistence on fighting from the front lines personally. The Arl chose the rebellion's battles carefully, and led the rebel forces to many victories against Orlesian forces, culminating in the capture of the port of Guarin. The rebels' successes came to an abrupt end in 899 Blessed, when they were lured into a trap at West Hill. The Orlesians tricked the Ferelden rebels into attacking the fort while preparing an ambush of their own to surround them. Arl Rendorn was killed in the fighting. Rowan survived the battle and escaped with the young Prince Marek, along with his best friend, Logain MacTyr, and an elf named Catriel. They fled into the Dwarven Deep Roads, and there Rowan and Logain confronted Marek with their suspicion that Catriel, who had provided the intelligence on West Hills, was an Orlesian agent. Marek, who had become infatuated with the elf, refused them outright but was forced to admit to his relationship with her. Alienated by Marek, Rowan and Logain later admitted they had been developing feelings for one another. They ultimately escaped the Deep Roads and rallied the rebellion in Guarin, winning an important battle against Orlesian forces that had come to reclaim the port. Catriel's duplicity was discovered, though Logain withheld information about a bounty that had been placed on her head, indicating that she had changed sides from Marek. Believing it was best for Ferelden and Marek, Logain discouraged Rowan from continuing their relationship, and told her to comfort Marek. Rowan reconciled with her betrothed, and they continued to fight Orlais. Rowan later accompanied Logain to the Battle of the River Dane, where the Fereldens confronted a force of Orlesian chevaliers sent to reinforce the usurper, and dealt them such a crushing defeat the Emperor refused to send any more reinforcements. Meanwhile, in Ansburg, the Margravine had decided to legally adopt Eamon and Tegan after receiving word of Arl Rendorn's death. Tegan was quite comfortable in his new life. He had been only 2 years old when their mother had brought them to Ansburg, and he remembered almost nothing about his homeland or his family beyond his brother. He preferred to play with his cousin Cador, with whom he was collectively named Trouble by the keep staff for all the mischief they caused. Eamon, however, was mindful of his heritage, and returned to Ferelden in 9-2 Dragon when Marek captured Denerim and slew the Orlesian usurper Megrin. Just because Megrin was gone did not mean the Orlesians were all gone from Ferelden, however. The Orlesians tried and failed to retake the capital by sea, and some areas remained occupied by Orlesians, including the family appointed to Redcliffe after Arl Rendorn abandoned it. Eamon joined with the rebels to retake the fortress. As luck would have it, Eamon caught the eye of a daughter of the very family occupying his ancestral home. The young girl, named Isolde, was sympathetic to the rebel cause, having lived in Ferelden most of her life. She developed an at the time one-sided infatuation for Eamon and began passing information to the resistance. Ultimately, the Orlesians were driven out and Eamon was able to reclaim his father's lands and title. Prince Merrick was crowned king and Rowan became his queen. They worked hard to rebuild their country, though Rowan studiously avoided Loghain, who had been made Tegan of Guarin, and always found a reason not to accompany Merrick's visits to him. In 9-5 Dragon, she gave birth to a son, Caelan Therin. Unfortunately, she would not have long to enjoy her new family. Rowan died of a wasting illness only 3 years later, which Merrick later suspected might have been contracted on their flight through the deep roads after the Battle of West Hill. On a more pleasant note, Eamon became a popular man after becoming Arl of Redcliffe. He was well-liked and politically astute. His efforts to improve trade and security in his lands were admired. He visited the court often, and his brother-in-law the king came to appreciate his calm practicality, considering him a trusted advisor and friend. So it was something of a scandal when he chose to marry an Orlesian woman. 6 years after reclaiming Redcliffe, Eamon was surprised to encounter Isolde in Denerim. Rather than fleeing the country with her family, Isolde had elected to stay behind and live with a cousin in the Ferelden capital. The two started a relationship and she returned with him to Redcliffe, where they ultimately married. As to the youngest Guarin, Tegan remained in Ansburg. On his 18th birthday, he received a letter from his brother asking him to return. Tegan was all set to refuse and go compete in a tournament in Starkhaven with his cousins, but his aunt convinced him that he should at least go to Denerim and tell his brother in person. He met his brother and his new wife in the capital, and went on a trip to Redcliffe with them. By the time they reached Lake Calenhad, Eamon had convinced his brother to stay and become the Ban of Rainsphere. Around 9-10 Dragon, King Merrick showed his utmost trust in Eamon when he entrusted him with the protection of his bastard son, Alistair. He wanted the boy raised away from court life and never told the true identity of his mother. A story was prepared about his mother being a servant in Redcliffe Castle. Eamon treated the boy fondly, though Isolde rankled at the rumors that Alistair was Eamon's bastard. Ultimately, she demanded her husband remove him from Redcliffe, and he was given to the Chantry to be trained as a Templar. The Guarin brothers and the rest of Ferelden enjoyed a period of relative peace. Even through the disappearance of King Merrick, Arl Eamon continued to act as an advisor to his nephew, the young King Caelan. Eamon and Isolde also welcomed a son into the world named Connor, whom Eamon doted upon. He could often be seen walking the walls of Redcliffe with the toddler on his shoulders. In 930 Dragon, however, Ferelden faced catastrophe when the 5th Blight began in the Kokari wilds. King Caelan assembled an army to meet them at the fortress of Ostagar. Arl Eamon was not able to send his forces to Ostagar soon enough, but cautioned his nephew against rushing to fight the Darkspawn horde too hastily. Around the same time, Arlessa Isolde discovered that Connor had the ability to use magic, which terrified her as it meant he would have to be sent to the Circle of Magi and would be unable to inherit. She hid this from her husband, whom she believed would turn Connor over to the Circle. The Battle of Ostagar proved to be a disaster. Teyrn Loghain withdrew his forces rather than flank the horde as had been planned, and King Caelan was killed along with almost all of Ferelden's Grey Wardens. Loghain returned to the capital and declared himself regent. Loghain was a hero, but his grab for power was disquieting, as noted by Ban Tegan, who called Loghain's withdrawal fortuitous before the assembled bands. A civil war broke out soon after. Arl Eamon may have been able to rally the opposition around him, but Loghain and his ally Rendon Howe had anticipated this. Back in Redcliffe, Isolde found an apostate mage to tutor Connor named Joan. The hope was that he could teach Connor enough to control and hide his magic. What she did not know was that Joan had been paid by men loyal to Loghain to poison the Arl. When Eamon fell ill, Joan was imprisoned, and Isolde flew into a panic. She became convinced that only a miracle could save her husband, and sent Redcliffe's knights on a quest to search for the urn of sacred ashes, containing the ashes of the prophet Andraste, and said to be capable of healing. Sending away the knights left Redcliffe vulnerable, but it was Connor's reaction that invited disaster. Still naive to the ways of magic, a demon of desire offered what the boy wanted most dearly, to save his father's life, and in accepting, Connor became possessed. The demon saved Eamon's life, but did not revive him, and he remained unconscious. It quickly took over the castle, forcing the Arlessa and guards to follow its orders. It also sundered the veil, allowing more demons to enter the world and possess corpses. By the time Ban Tegan arrived to see his brother, the village was being terrorized nightly by the undead. Thankfully, the surviving Grey Wardens, one of whom was Alistair, who had been recruited before taking his vows as a Templar, arrived seeking the Arl's aid. With help from Tegan, they were able to infiltrate the castle and resolve the matter of Connor's possession, but Arl Eamon remained in a coma. Miraculously, the Wardens were able to track down a scholar who had worked out the likely location of Andraste's ashes and retrieve a pinch of the sacred remains. The ashes worked, and Eamon was revived. Once the Wardens had gathered what allies they could, Eamon brought the Wardens to Denerim and called for a landsmeet. He hoped to remove Loghain from power by putting forth Alistair as a candidate for the throne. Ultimately, Loghain was removed from power and Ferelden united once more. The Warden's forces and Ferelden's armies gathered at Redcliffe to fight the Darkspawn, but the Archdemon surprised them, launching a sudden attack on Denerim. The joined forces rushed to meet them and battled in the burning city. The Guarin soldiers fought beside the Wardens that day and saw the end of the Blight. After the Fifth Blight, Eamon decided to stay in Denerim permanently as an advisor to the crown. Without an heir, he passed the Arling of Redcliffe to his brother Tegan. Both brothers would serve the crown closely from then on. Tegan served as Ferelden's ambassador to Orlais for several years. In fact, his subjects complained that he spends so much of his time abroad in the free marches, especially during grand tourney years, they could be governed just as well by a portrait. In 941 Dragon, the Ferelden crown chose to give shelter to Grand Enchanter Fiona and the mages she led in rebellion against the Chantry in Redcliffe. Unfortunately, when the mages chose to ally with Magister Guarin Alexius of Tevinter, he evicted Arl Tegan and his forces from Redcliffe Castle, forcing him to go to the capital for aid in ousting them. In 944 Dragon, the crown chose again to trust Tegan as its representative. He was sent to the Exalted Council called by Divine Victoria to represent Ferelden's interests as they determined the future of the new Inquisition. The Guarins have had a critical role in shaping the history of modern Ferelden, and remain positioned to continue influencing the course of the kingdom. Well, I almost didn't do this video, but I figured there was enough interesting material to go over. I have just one interesting thing to mention. Dragon Age Inquisition players may remember that there's a Fort Connor in the hinterlands that the Codex entry claims Eamon built and named it after his father. Writer Patrick Weeks has confirmed that this was a mistake on his part, and then said Eamon has two dads now. I took that as a glib joke about his mistake and decided not to include it, but apparently some people decided that this mean Arl Rendorn has a gay lover named Connor that Eamon saw as a second father. I don't know, you can decide for yourself what to do with that. Regardless, I hope you liked the video and look for more coming soon.